there's a lot of information being shared, and I know a lot of questions being asked about sharing the presentation. They will be on the teachers workshop portal shortly, so don't worry. As you can see, there's many interesting ways to integrate Asian American material into your curriculum, including art. Now we have some time for questions and answers, and then followed by discussion led by our Teachers Advisory Group. So if you look at the Q&A button on the bottom, you can input that information in there. Also, you can raise your hand and then we'll unmute your microphone so that we can actually have a live conversation. Feel free to put your ideas into the Jamboard, and the link is already also in the chat box. So here we go. Let me actually first share a screen with you. There was a question asked about teaching the material in the classroom. Here I am sharing with you a screen that was prepared by one of our partner organization, Committee of 100. This map actually shows you what happens to the different states at different stages of requiring Asian American curricula into the classroom, as well as ethnic study curricula. 2 states have not done anything yet, which is Vermont and Louisiana. And there are 5 states that haven't done any specific requirement yet. But you can see the red ones are the ones that are very staging of requiring Asian American studies and ethnic studies into the high school and beyond curricula. And then the blue ones are the ones just requiring ethnic studies. Hopefully this gives you some idea of the confusion that's going on with the requirement throughout the United States. And I hope that's helpful to you. Okay. And let me stop sharing screen. And did you guys see the share or not see the share? Give me a thumbs up if you saw the share. Okay, good. Let's get back to just questions and answers. Nir, can you bring up the speakers, please?
Yeah. Can you please remove the share screen, or you can?
Yes,
or you want to...
there you go. Great, thank you. So there's a few questions here, and I'd like to pose it to both Locke and Margaret. And if you can unmute yourselves and answer the questions. First question up is there a percentage of the type of early 19th century labor documented? Contracted, indentures, and enslaved. Do we also know the country of origin of each type?
It would take some digging. They're not, easily available, but if you're looking at the Asian American population in specific, it's going to be, yeah, I mean, I would refer people to start with the history books, the basic historical documentation of Asian American immigration, and work from there, through the bibliographies. But I don't think there is an already made sort of text, or an already made sort of diagram showing that breakdown.
Sounds great. Again, I think this question is more directed to Locke. It says income disparity among Asian American on your slide 23, which is a Pew Research slide. Does the data include information about the Asian American population that developed a type of Chinatown in Brooklyn, New York?
All the information, it should encompass all the data that is collected around the United States. So, on a micro level of Brooklyn, it should be included. But I did note in my answer to that is, we have to understand that data is always incomplete. We are only capturing what the estimates, right, of what what could be culled from the data that's collected. So, for instance, a lot of undocumented population among Asian Americans may not be necessarily included in this data. So, but it gives us a reference point to work with. It's not necessarily a 100% accurate, but it's just a way to understand the spread, the scale, etc. But yeah, on the level of Brooklyn Chinatown, absolutely, probably the Flushing Chinatown, there is a science around this data representation. So all of that should be included.
I assume for undocumented and also perhaps people that don't speak English fluently, they might be self-selected to not be part of the data collection, correct?
It could be. I mean, without knowing the exact science of how they, the methodology that they did that, I can't really say. But certainly, those two, are plausible reasons for why they may not be fully represented in that figure.
The next question is actually quite interesting. What are some of the examples of Asian American activism? I think that question is really both for Margaret and for Locke. So why don't we start with Margaret first? I think it's representation of their activism through art. Do you have any other examples other than what you've presented?
Well, I think definitely Carlos Villa was important in that he intersected with the rise of ethnic studies as a department. And so as someone who witnessed the Third World Liberation Front movement and all of those influences, he worked very hard as a community organizer to uplift artists of color. And so he created some of the first websites celebrating Filipino American artists and artists of color to expand the art history canon. So even though that's, maybe a limited field, we're talking about art history, it's still important because of the media images, right, that draw from the art history canon, and to expand who could be seen as a fine artist, because again, a lot of women artists were seen as doing crafts, not art. That was so important. So he created websites, and I'll put them in the chat. One called Worlds in Collision. And so look that up on Google. And then there's one called rehistoricizing.org. And he was rehistoricizing the time around abstract expressionism. So both he and Bernice Bing were abstract expressionist painters, but weren't accepted by, say, the New York elite art world because they weren't what they considered fine artists. And so taking a look at his websites actually is that his websites were an act of activism. They were part of his trying to ripple out and affect people and give people that step up.
Locke?
Sure. I think there are many cases of Asian American activism, so many. It is invisible, however, because we don't think of Asian Americans as being political activists, involved in social movements. But just based on the images that I showed on the missing history, of activists, you'll see Yuri Kochiyama, which Margaret also mentioned, a civil rights activist, who was based in New York, who worked alongside Malcolm X around, cross-racial civil rights movement, but also critical to the Japanese American redress movement. We have Larry Itlion, who was shown next to Cesar Chavez. He was one of the prominent labor activists, around the agricultural workers movement. And he, in fact, he was an immigrant in the 1930s and worked alongside Cesar Chavez. He was the one who inspired the protests, movement to increase the rights and social justice, for workers. You have Grace Lee Boggs is also another person that comes up repeatedly, that was based in Detroit, that was working alongside the workers' rights movement there. Very early on, she and her husband, were involved. And so we have these multiple cases, in addition to the Asian American student movement, right, of the 1960s that helped founded ethnic studies. Asian American studies grew out of the 1960s movement. And without that movement, I mean, the kind of scholarship that we have today may not exist. It is because of the student movements of the 1960s that created the institutional framework, to cultivate the research and the teaching of Asian American studies, Chicanx, Latinx studies, Native American studies, and African American studies. So that is a critical mobilization. And if you look at today's movements around the anti-Asian violence, it's just been tremendous. And so all these are movements, and there's so many other critical movements that I didn't even mention, the Vincent Chin social movement. So I think you just need to do that search online or through the books and really pay attention. It's everywhere, really. It just depends on how far you dig into it.
I appreciate that. Helen Zia, who is obviously the activist author who had been on the Vincent Chin case, have actually provided a lot of information in terms of the racism and hatred against Asian Americans. And those resources are all in our Teachers Workshop portal. So thank you for all this. I'd like to bring up next is our Teachers Advisory Group. And then they will guide the conversation about how to use some of this material into the classroom. And please use the Jamboard to post your information. And Saya McKenna will be our facilitator through that mechanism. And we will then take a break at about 9:45. So Saya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everybody. I want to thank Margaret Yee and Professor Lok-Soo so much for the incredible information. Just by way of introduction, I am a teacher, a veteran teacher, and now an administrator. And I've taught English and history, Asian studies, ethnic studies. I've led trips to Asia, and I have helped support the Asia Club at our school. And so I'm really inspired by the way that all of this information intersects and can be applicable by grade level, by discipline, by community orientation and position. I myself, for example, feel very uplifted to see this history spotlighted as a biracial Japanese American woman whose father was incarcerated at Poston, went through Tan Fran, whose grandfather was an artist, and who basically was the product of a marriage that would have been illegal 4 years earlier in some states. So for me, at least, the way that I loved to go to webinars to be a learner is to think about the influence of content, how it enriches my ability to be a teacher, to learn, the resources that are provided. And I just want to make sure that everybody is aware that the 1990 Institute and our presenters have put together an incredible array of resources that are extensions and applications. I put in the chat the link to the website, and those resources are available. But then also the community that's built in partnership with other teachers who are present. And that's where I would really encourage people. And I want to thank those of you who have already done so to put some materials into the Jamboard. Many of those questions Sandra Pan has already covered, and Sam Yee, who is one of my former students and is also assisting. If Sam, you could put up the Jamboard just by way of a visual, that would be wonderful. Just to say that this can be a really great way for people to connect in the webinar format, which doesn't lend itself as nicely to some of the interactions that we get in person. Thinking, for example, about, how does this apply to your work? What will you make of it? How will you implement it with your students? Margaret is a master teacher and a former colleague of mine, and thank you, Margaret, for all of those applications. I want to encourage people now to either put questions into the Q&A or also put ideas into these Jamboard slides about how we can, as a community of educators, think and share about how we might apply this. I see a lot of information about the mapping activity. I see the identity work being applicable. I know that when I taught American-born Chinese in the 7th grade and in the 12th grade, we did a lot of history around immigration, on representation, and Margaret's materials in particular were very helpful to me, but Professor Sue's now would be of additional enrichment. So I believe that you now as participants have the ability to like raise your hand or ask questions. And I just wanted to invite people to do that. And maybe I would start by introducing one of the questions that came up in the Jamboard about why we do not actually discuss or teach or spotlight Asian American history in the classroom. Is it teacher training, prior knowledge, school policy, parental pushback? I would love to hear from the participants. Maybe your own experience.
If you want to raise your hand at the bottom icon, we can unmute your mic and have a live exchange. While you're thinking about that, let me also introduce you to Lisa Ernst. Lisa is a teacher at the Alice Fong Yu School in San Francisco, and she will share with you some ideas of how she implemented this particular topic in her classroom. Lisa, do you mind sharing your screen?
Sorry, I think the other share has to be off, I guess.
Yes, I
for me.
do.
Okay, thank you. I'm very excited to be here, and I really do appreciate what they shared. I mean, it's so phenomenal. So I wanted to share how I use this in my classroom. And this slideshow will be available as well. So this drawing in the background is actually a former student who did the zodiac for us on one of our railroad cards. So I teach 6th grade science, English, and social studies, and I teach in a Chinese immersion public school. So I use art all the time. So the art I'm going to share an art installation and some political cartoons that 6th graders did in a media challenge, and then a activity about stamp art, and then the Monkey King, the mythical figure of a block art sculpture that we made. And then the last piece is our puzzle pieces formed to design the pieces of social justice. So this puzzle piece is one of my favorite, I mean, this installation, excuse me, is one of my favorites to see. It's called the Old Gold Mountain, and it was made by Hung Lu, and it's about the railroad tracks and fortune cookies. There's over 200,000 fortune cookies. And this is a great way to start talking about art. And none of the fortune cookies have fortunes in it. And it has, it was an installation I saw in Nevada. And it brings out a lot of critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. So art has always been one of my mainstays when I'm starting a unit or I'm trying to get some writing from my students to kind of think, because this is very provocative. And for me, when I went to see the exhibit, I spent like 2 hours there just thinking about how can I integrate this into my classroom. This piece is actually done by one of my students, my 6th graders, when we were in COVID. He did this on Google Drawing and submitted it to KQED. As you can see, art has very many mediums like Margaret shared, and this is a really great explanation about social justice and climate change. The second one was done by another student of mine, Yu Fang, and she actually made the top 10 at KQED, and this was all about COVID. And these were all drawn on Google Drawings. So we have all kinds of kids who can illustrate in many formats. This one was done through the 2 books, and these are great middle school books. One is called Chasing Secrets, and the other one is The Lost Garden, and that's about Lauren Shamp. So I had the kids create their own stamps to submit. And then this is one of my favorite projects. Adam's seen it on numerous times. I've done many themes, but this one I wanted to do around the theme of Monkey King. Each child got a block that was 4x4, and they picked a section of it to pick of the story and illustrate it, and then was put together in a art exhibit. And then the last piece that I do every year is all about social justice. And these pieces, I mean, it's just a simple format that you could do. And each kid chooses a topic. And our themes were Black Lives Matter. I mean, our studies were Asian studies, climate change, African-American studies, and the suffrage movement. So each child assigned that. So I'm going to stop sharing, but I just wanted to share ways that you can integrate. It's not that hard to do. And I really enjoy art in the classroom. And because I teach 3 subject areas, it's so much easier to integrate. I do have a fine arts degree, but I found that I've learned a lot more about just fine arts, drawing and painting. So I hope that you can possibly use these, and these will be available for you to see. Anybody have any questions about those?
And I understand that we will now be able to call the participants by name, and when you raise your hand, and allow you to unmute. And so please, I just wanted to recognize that Barbarina Davidson and Kay Bradley had also posed some questions. So Barbarina Davidson, if you would like to unmute.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it would be interesting to be able to tie in how Asian and Native Americans are similar when they were doing the crossing of, what is that? The bridge between, I can't remember what the bridge was called, the ice bridge between Russia and Alaska. Because in US studies and history, they don't really talk about that much. And most of, because I teach US history and world history for high schools, and they don't allow a lot of wiggle room to actually discuss Native American history. November is supposed to be Native American History Month, but you won't find anything really celebrating or noting that. And so anytime I try to pull that more of that in to the classroom, it gets more time crunched for state tests and crunch for the holidays and everything. So, trying to incorporate more things in is nice, and I like to be able to do double jobs at the same time. So that's kind of nice.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that idea of like the more that we learn, the more that we want to address, the tighter the time constraints feel restrictive. And so those intersections are really powerful. And I also saw examples in all of these cases of like the way, for example, that student application or student choice could also help to address some of those time constraints. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Is there another question? Somebody raised their hand? No?
Yes, Sarah.
Go
Sarah.
ahead.
Hi, good morning. I had a question for the art teacher, Ernst. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your last name.
It's Ernst, but I'm not an art teacher, but I do teach art.
Okay. My question is specifically about art installation. And I teach at a relatively small space in my classroom, and I teach 3rd and 4th grade, and I have them for 2 years, so I loop with them. Do you have recommendations on how you could, I guess, start an art piece and have it throughout the year and have it kind of develop so that by the end students can see the development of like an art piece in a smaller scale as opposed to like a take over the space kind of thing? Because that's been always a challenge for me. Thank you.
Oh, actually, I have a new piece in my classroom, which is a rolling bulletin board. It's very small. One side's got a bulletin board, one's got a whiteboard. So we keep adding pieces to it. And it doesn't take up too much space. I actually got it donated from somebody's business. And so it's really nice because then I can roll it outside. And when the kids come to school, they can see the art exhibit. So I'm trying to do that once a month, where I put it outside and the kids come in, they see it as they come in, and I roll it back into my classroom.
Okay, that's a great idea. Thank you.
And I was going to ask Professor Sue also, I mean, you are a teacher yourself and you have all of this wonderful content. Do you have any suggestions for the way in which this material might be delivered in like a high school or a middle school classroom based on your own practice or experience working with teachers?
I mean, I would say, you know, students really appreciate the multimedia mode of presentation. And so anything that you can show through visuals as well as audio, you know, and narratives and history, and you tie that all together, I think, you know, students really get a fuller understanding of the different facets that inform this, you know, any issue.
Yeah, and I really appreciated and noted on your resource page, for example, that you had graphic novels, not only, you know, by published authors, but ones that it looks like you have helped to construct that would add visual elements to the historical timeline. Is there anything else on that resource page that you'd like to call to people's attention?
There are a lot of video shorts that I just want to, I know that the Institute, 1990 Institute, and you can find this also all over YouTube, but there are lots of short videos that are quite excellent instructional materials. You know, 1990 Institute does a wonderful job of curating these short videos. So you have, you know, you have those accessible on their website. And I have to say, you know, the pieces are excellent. And again, there's no shortage. It's a matter of curating and sort of bringing them to the foreground of what are the most important pieces, the most potent and effective pieces. But, you know, short videos are excellent, you know, and they enliven the conversation, you know, so that it's not just coming from a talking head, but, you know, it shows multiple perspectives. It really, you know, those are wonderful resources. There are lots of documentaries that exist as well, you know, out there. Those can be used as well. And, you know, I know that 1990 is doing a lot in sort of to bring together this collection. And I would advise people to go on their website and take a look. There will be more of that done over the course of time as well.
Wow, thank you for that plug. That was fantastic. Thank you for everybody for your participation. Now we have a few minutes to take a break until our next speaker comes up, which is John Trevina. During this break, we actually will be showing some of the short videos that Locke had mentioned. We'll be back ready for more conversation at 10 o'clock sharp.